The world's emotions to Donald Trump's re-election as U.S. president have ranged from strong resistance to eager backing from longtime U.S. friends. A lot of people are worried about what Trump's return to office means for the region's economy, foreign policy, and security. The European Union is one of the most concerned groups. From the middle of the 20th century to now, the relationship between the European Union, EU, and the United States has changed a lot. It now includes teamwork, competition, and sometimes conflict in many areas. The U.S. was one of the main forces behind the creation of NATO and has been its biggest provider ever since, giving both military and financial help to keep the area stable. Soon, NATO was the main source of security in the West, tying the U.S. and Western Europe together in a promise to protect each other. During the 1960s and 1970s, transatlantic ties were put to the test. There were differences over how much NATO should spend on defense, and the U.S. wanted Europe to contribute more to the Union. The Suez Crisis in 1956 showed that different groups had different ideas about how to deal with the effects of colonialism. The Vietnam War was another source of disagreement, with many European leaders being against U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia. There were big changes in the relationship between the U.S. and Western Europe because of the oil problem. It made their partnership more complicated. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, put an oil ban on countries that backed Israel in the Yom Kippur War in October 1973. The U.S. and the Netherlands were among those countries that were hit. This move caused serious oil shortages and prices to rise, which had a huge effect on businesses in the West. To save energy, the U.S. did things like price controls, fuel rationing, and a national speed limit. In Europe, countries that were facing more immediate shortages, policies like car-free Sundays and limits on industrial energy use were put in place. Both the US and Europe rethought their energy policies after the energy crisis of the 1970s. They invested in alternate energy sources, made their energy use more efficient, and tried to become less dependent on oil from the Middle East. Although the crisis made things more difficult between the two countries, it also showed how much their economies depend on each other and how important it is to work together to solve world problems after the Cold War ended in 1990. Before the end of the Cold War in 1991, bilateral ties had changed a lot. The US and the EU had to rethink their relationship in order to deal with new world problems. The US and the European community made their partnership official with the Transatlantic Statement in 1990. This set up a way for them to talk politics and work together in many areas. This statement set up summits every other year, cabinet meetings every year, and more regular meetings of top officials and working groups to improve how the two groups talk to each other and work together. The new Transatlantic Agenda, NTA, was released in December 1995. Its goal was to improve teamwork by describing steps that would be taken together in four main areas: world peace, security, democracy, and development. Both sides promised to work together to deal with problems like foreign crime, drug trafficking, terrorism, protecting the environment, and stopping diseases. They planned to do this by taking steps that would help trade grow and bring the two economies closer together. In the early 2000s, the US and the European Union worked together and had disagreements. The terrorist acts on September 11, 2001, led to a coordinated reaction that made people work together more to fight terrorism. But the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 showed that there were big rifts in the transatlantic alliance. France and Germany, two of the EU's most important members, were against the attack. There were tense foreign ties because of this argument, which showed that people have different ideas about how to keep the world safe and use armed force. During this time, economic ties between the US and EU continued to grow. In 2004, the transatlantic economy made up about 40% of the world's GDP and 3/4 of all world trade. The US sent $184 billion worth of goods to the EU and bought $282 billion worth of goods from the EU. This shows how economically dependent the two countries are on each other. When Donald Trump was elected as president in 2016, things changed. Trade, climate change, and defense spending all became more contentious. It was hard for the EU to deal with these changes while trying to protect multilateralism and the rules-based international order. When Joe Biden was elected as president in 2020, there was an increased focus on cooperation between the US and EU. The EU-US Trade and Technology Council, TTC, was created to manage how key global trade, economic, and technology problems were dealt with. The return of Donald Trump as US president is likely to make things more difficult between the US and the EU. Security, trade, climate policies, and the safety of world politics will likely be some of the main areas of disagreement. European leaders are afraid that if the US cuts off or stops helping Ukraine, it could be seen as an act of attack by Russia and make the area less stable. Trump's America First trade policies have caused tariffs to be put on European goods, which has strained economic ties and made people worry that if he wins re-election, trade fights could start up again with tariffs on European imports, which would hurt businesses in the EU. The EU has been a world leader in fighting climate change, but Trump's win could make it harder for countries to work together on climate issues and make it harder to align environmental policies across the Atlantic. European countries are especially worried that if Trump stays in office, international climate deals could be weakened. The Wall Street Journal said that Trump's friends are worried about his presidency because an authoritarian axis threatens the US's order in the EU. Trump's America First policy could mean more taxes and trade conflicts, which would be bad for the EU's economy. Another issue that worries people is environmental policy. The EU is a leader in taking action on climate change, but Trump has a history of rolling back rights for the environment. The EU is worried that Trump's method will make it harder for countries to work together to solve global problems and start international climate initiatives. These possible clashes show that the EU is wary of US-EU ties under Trump. This is because Europe is ready for policy changes and threats to its global interests.